Today's webinar is another addition to our COVID-19 Pivot series, and we're going to provide an update on COVID vaccines. This topic has been receiving a lot of attention since Health Canada approved both the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines back in December. Both family physicians and their patients want to know how these new vaccines work, their effectiveness at protecting us from getting the virus, the risk of adverse events, and of course, when they should expect to receive their first dose. To address these issues and more, we've invited an expert panel of speakers to join us today. I'll introduce each of them and ask that they say a quick hello and review any conflicts of interest. Let me start by welcoming Dr. Gerald Evans. Dr. Evans is the chair of the Division of Infectious Diseases and a professor in the departments of medicine, biomedical and molecular sciences, and pathology and molecular medicine at Queen's University. He's an attending physician at Kingston Health Sciences Centre and has been medical director of infection prevention and control there, as well as Providence Care Hospital since 2011. Dr. Evans, can you please say hello and review your conflicts of interest?
Thanks very much, Alan, and thanks for inviting me to be here. I really have no conflicts of interest whatsoever. My biggest role at the moment, other than providing advice for my local region and hospital, is sitting on the Ontario COVID-19 Science Advisory Table.
Excellent. All right, next is Dr. Mike Colber. Dr. Colber is a family physician in Peace River, Alberta. He's a professor in the Department of Family Medicine at the University of Alberta, assistant director of the Evidence and CPD program at the Alberta College of Family Physicians, and an executive member of the PEER, which stands for Patients Experience Evidence Research team. Dr. Colber, please say hello and review your conflicts of interest.
Hi, good morning or good afternoon for those on the East Coast. My conflicts are all related to not-for-profits, honorariums and that kind of stuff. And I actually founded a U of A spinoff company looking at quality metrics in endoscopy, which has not made a penny. So it's a not-for-profit.
Excellent. And finally, last but not least, Dr. Caroline Quash. Dr. Quash is the chair of NACI, the National Advisory Committee on Immunization. She's a pediatric infectious diseases consultant, medical microbiologist, and epidemiologist. She's the medical lead of the Infection Prevention and Control Unit at the CHU St. Justine and a professor at the University of Montreal. Dr. Quash, say hello and please review your conflicts of interest.
So good afternoon. Thank you for inviting me. The only interest I have is to be the chair of NACI. Thank you.
Perfect. So I'll now review my conflicts of interest. My listed affiliations are on the screen. I work for the CFPC as a physician advisor, and I get remunerated for other leadership roles that are listed on this slide. The organization listed here are all not-for-profit, and I have no affiliation and receive no funding from the pharmaceutical industry. We're now going to quickly go over the 3 learning objectives for today's webinar. So we're going to compare the novel characteristics of the first available COVID-19 vaccines approved by Health Canada. We're going to evaluate the effectiveness and safety of approved COVID-19 vaccines anticipated to be distributed in Canada, and we're going to explore the approach to early plans for COVID-19 vaccination rollout within Canada. Couple quick housekeeping points before we get going. For everyone on YouTube, if you're watching, please submit your questions in the chat window for our live Q&A at the end by logging into your own Google or YouTube account. And if you can't see the chat window, you may be in full screen mode. We'll try to address as many questions that we can at the end of the webinar. And in terms of Main Pro Plus credits, if you're watching this as a live webcast, it is eligible for 1 Main Pro Plus credit. In order to claim your credit, you'll need to complete a short registration survey. The link will be posted in the chat or comments window several times during the webinar, including at the end. And we ask you to complete it by the end of the day, Friday this week. So let's get rolling and right into it. The first question I'm going to ask is for Dr. Evans. Gerald, can you explain how mRNA vaccines like the approved Pfizer, BioNTech, and Moderna product work to protect people against the COVID-19 virus?
Yeah, thanks very much, Alan. So the development and use of novel vaccine platforms like mRNA are really, really exciting, important, and part of the reason why we moved quickly. So let's talk about the mRNA vaccines. And if you want, maybe you can bring up that one slide, the first slide that we have there. So mRNA vaccines basically use messenger RNA to teach the cellular machinery within a cell, how to make the protein, in this case it's the spike protein or the receptor binding domain of the spike protein, which is then created within the cells by delivery through a lipid nanoparticle into the muscle cell, as you can see in the slide. That mRNA then merges out, the cell makes the spike protein, it moves out to the surface of the cell and is expressed. At that point, the immune system recognizes that spike protein as being a foreign protein, and it creates antibodies against it. And those antibodies in turn then bind to the spike protein of the virus and prevent the spike protein from attaching to the cell receptor, which is called ACE2 in humans, which then results in infection. So it protects by neutralizing the attachment portion of the virus from attaching to a cell in humans. This is the first time we've used mRNA for an infectious disease vaccine, but mRNA technology actually has been used already in some human cancer treatments. So it's a novel platform. It's exciting. It's very fixable. You can actually just tweak that mRNA if you come up with an alternative spike protein that you have to make a protein against or an antibody against, and that can be done very, very quickly. So an exciting and new way to make vaccines.
That's excellent. And Gerald, one other follow-up question. There seem to be some concerns from some people that some of these vaccines may be permanently in our DNA when the mRNA goes into our cells. Can you explain why this isn't going to happen?
Yeah, so now you have to go back to your cell biology classes that many of you may have attended in your undergraduate years, and remember that once mRNA is translated into a protein, it's destroyed. It does not exist. There's inbuilt mechanisms to get rid of that mRNA molecule so that it doesn't go on to produce more. And it's really important to understand that you know the translation of transcription of RNA into DNA does not happen in most human eukaryotic cells because we don't possess a reverse transcriptase. Reverse transcriptase, of course, is an enzyme that is present in some viruses like hepatitis B virus and HIV, but does not include in humans. So you can't make that RNA convert into a DNA and then reinsert it into the genome of an individual. So this vaccine does not alter human DNA. It is not a secret, special way of somehow reprogramming humans, which I think is essentially part of the sort of conspiracy theory that arises when people hear about this.
That's excellent. The next question is for Dr. Kolber. Mike, how effective are the Pfizer, BioNTech, and the Moderna vaccines, and how confident are you in the data with regards to reducing COVID infections?
Great. Thanks, Alan. You bet. Let's review the big three, and knowing that 2 are approved currently and 1 is being under review, the AstraZeneca right now by Health Canada. So I'll start with the Pfizer. We'll start to time Pfizer, Moderna, and then AstraZeneca. And I think it's important for the listeners to know that we're going to talk about symptomatic cases as far as the numbers that the outcomes that we're looking at. And I think it's always really important to know that this is an interim analysis of a 1 to 2 year study where they actually looked at an event analysis and looked at kind of 2 months of data. So really early in 2 months of data, and therefore I'd really just make sure that we don't look at all subgroups and all this other stuff. And just want to make sure that we know that this is a per protocol analysis. This is based on those that got 2 shots of the vaccine, and our outcomes were determined 7 or 14 days after the second shot, irrespective of baseline COVID status. So with that in mind, Pfizer looked at 40,000 mostly US patients, adults over the age of 16 years, and median age was about 51 years of age. They got 2 doses, again, 21 days apart. And for COVID cases, is about 95% relative risk reduction. Again, about 200 overall COVID cases and a 95% reduction in those that got the vaccine. For severe COVID, there was 1 case in the vaccine and 4 in the placebo. And we'll talk about adverse events probably later. So that's the efficacy of Pfizer. So 95% relative risk reduction. For Moderna, about the same relative risk reduction, 94%. This was on 30,000 US adults greater or equal to 18 years of age. And again, officially a 94.1% relative risk reduction. Severe COVID, and severe COVID, maybe for those that don't know, severe COVID is obviously a symptomatic COVID into your ICU and end organ damage, whether it be respiratory failure, heart failure, all these other things, and includes death. For severe COVID for Moderna, there was no cases in the vaccine and 30 with placebo. Finally, for AstraZeneca so I'm very, very confident in the Pfizer and Moderna results. The AstraZeneca takes a bit of work to go through because there's actually a compilation of 3 studies, and there's a few nuances that are probably important. This was on 11,000 UK and Brazilian adults greater or equal to 18 years of age. There were 2 doses in this one, but partway through, initially when they started this, there was going to be a single dose, and they said, I think we need a second dose. And 50% of the patients in the AstraZeneca trial got their second dose after 12 weeks of the first dose. Overall, AstraZeneca was 70% effective in reducing the risk of symptomatic COVID cases. And as many of your listeners are aware, there was 2 kind of subgroups of this, with a low dose first shot or a high dose first shot. The low dose first shot was 90% relative effective, and the standard or high dose first shot was 62%. But you have to look at that, and actually the low dose group was actually 90% of the low dose group were healthcare workers, and they were all in younger adults. And so I really don't think it was done super well. It's almost like a cohort within an RCT, a multiple RCTs. And so I think overall we would say AstraZeneca has 70% relative effectiveness in preventing COVID cases. For severe COVID, 1 case in the vaccine and 2 in the placebo. So overall, my confidence in these outcomes, these are large-scale trials, often multi-country, and they look, while it's a running race, it's like a 800-meter race, and we're kind of looking at the first 100 meters. It sure appears that the Pfizer and Moderna are about 95% relative effective to prevent COVID case, and again, the AstraZeneca 70%. And again, I don't think that we should say, oh, we should go for the low dose, because I think there's some inherent issues with how they did the low dose. The final comment, which is really funny, as you know, AstraZeneca and Oxford were the vaccine was a compilation. One of the groups, either I can't remember if it was Astra or Oxford, said there was a administrative error to give the low dose, and the other person, the other group, said no, this was a protocol amendment, and trust me, it was a protocol amendment partway through. So didn't quite get their story straight when this first came out. So that's kind of the high-level evidence on the big 3 currently either available or likely soon to be available in Canada.
That was excellent. And we will be getting back to the adverse events that you mentioned before. Just before we get to Caroline Gerald, I had one follow-up for you just on the subject of the vaccine. So, everybody's hearing about this new variant of the COVID-19 virus in several parts of the world, and even in Canada. How concerned are you about this in terms of in general, and whether it will impact the success of the vaccine rollout?
Thanks, Alan. So, I think everyone understands now that we know that viruses, and particularly RNA viruses, develop mutations during viral replication. The frequency of viral replication worldwide right now is tremendous, and so it's not surprising that these variants have emerged. And then the question becomes, what's their relevance? So there's 2 ones that we're well aware of now that are currently undergoing some very careful and intense analysis. One is B117, which is also called the UK variant, and the other one is the S501YV2, which is a South African variant. And they actually contain some similar mutations that may or may not be relevant. We know that these variants have spread worldwide already. The GISAID web portal reports viral sequences being found around the world. And of course, we all know that they are certainly some isolates been found in Canada as well as the United States. They share in common something called an N501Y mutation, which actually affects that spike protein. And we talked about how important the spike protein is, because the mRNA in the vaccines is coded to make your cells produce that spike protein so you develop an antibody response. So the question becomes, do these variants possess a property then that would make our current vaccine perhaps less effective or not effective at all, which would be the most worrisome thing? And I would have to say, of the 2 variants, the South African one has more mutations in that spike protein than other ones, and so that can be probably relevant to whether or not that might be the one that we have problems with. So having said all that, if we can bring up the next slide that I have here, this is a report from a group at the University of Texas Medical School, and Vic Menacri is a virologist down there, and they've actually done a study looking at 20 participants who received the Pfizer vaccine, so that's the BioNTech 162b2 vaccine, and looked to see how effective were the antibodies that vaccine produced in preventing not just wild type, which you can see on the y-axis, but the SARS-CoV-2 mutant that contains the N501Y mutation. And what you can see here is that's essentially a coefficient almost 1. In other words, the antibodies produced by the current vaccine seem to be very effective at the same level as we see for neutralizing virus, both with the mutation and without the mutation. So right now, at least, it doesn't look like those mutations are a particular problem for us, at least with the vaccines that we currently have and with these ones. But of course, we have to stay on top of this story, because the big problem is going to be ultimately, are these variants going to sufficiently change and produce other mutations which might actually impact on how effective the vaccine is? And the South African one, you can take a slide down now, the South African one actually contains another mutation called E484K, which may or may not have some pertinence, but it doesn't look like that at the moment. So far so good, and an important message as to why we must roll out the vaccine as quick as possible in order to address this and really shut down that viral replication that's going on worldwide.
That's great. That's some great reassurance for our audience. All right, now, Dr. Quash, it usually takes years to develop and approve a vaccine. So how are the new COVID-19 vaccines able to get approval so quickly? And should we be worried that things may have been overlooked in terms of safety issues as these were rolled out?
Right. So as you know, the 3 phases of vaccine trials were followed. So phase 1, 2, and 3 did happen. The other preclinical studies had been done in part on the SARS-CoV-1, but also on the MERS-CoV. And so when the genome of this particular virus was known, people could quickly move into the phase 1. I think that the main difference between what we're seeing now and what we used to see is that the time between phases has been much constrained, mainly due to the financial contributions of governments and various non-for-profit organizations to make sure that the funding necessary for the next phase of the studies were able to start right away and not have to wait for 18 months or so to be able to come up with that money. The other difference also is that the phase 3 trials were able to recruit very quickly. Both companies, and in fact all companies, have put all their resources available to be able to get participants in, and we were sort of, lucky enough to have enough COVID exposure to have outcomes that we were able to assess. And so everything that was supposed to be done was done. The only difference is that in the phase 3, instead of waiting the year or 2 years to the end of the trial, the data were submitted early after the first 2 doses were administered, but having enough time to look at 2 months of safety after the second dose and efficacy at the same time point. So the approvals in Canada are conditional approvals, which means that the companies are asked to continue to follow their participants in time to the end of the study to make sure that there are no other adverse events following immunization that could be reported, but we are not expecting any of those. It's not a high likelihood that those will be happening. Thank you.
Okay, excellent. We're going to go back to Dr. Evans for a moment. So Gerald, there's some other innovations in upcoming vaccines that I think are still sort of either waiting for Health Canada approval or they're being submitted to Health Canada. Can you just review some of the other technologies, like aside from the mRNA technology, and when you expect these to probably arrive in Canada?
Yeah, happy to, Alan. So maybe I could bring up that slide, which is a quick little graphic, just to sort of give you a flavor for all of these novel vaccine platforms that are being used to tackle COVID-19 and the SARS-CoV-2 virus. So 2 of them that have already been mentioned, the mRNA vaccine, you can see at the top, which, as I say, codes for the spike protein, which then is made by cellular machinery in your body and for which you develop an immune response. But some of the other ones, including the AstraZeneca Oxford vaccine, use a non-replicating viral vector, in this case a chimpanzee adenovirus, in which instead of an mRNA code, there's a DNA code that's inserted into that virus. When that is injected into you, that DNA gets converted into a messenger RNA template, which again codes for the spike protein for which you want to develop an antibody response. We, of course, and there are some technologies around the world that are using the old type platforms like inactivated viruses, like you would see, for instance, with a hepatitis A vaccine or any of the other sort of typical killed polio vaccines. And then some groups are working on subunit spike proteins. So that's would be sort of similar to what we see with hepatitis B, where you're injected not with the virus, but just with the protein. In the case of hepatitis B, it's a surface antigen protein. But you can also make spike protein either through recombinant technology in a yeast or bacterial vector. In the case of one Canadian company, they're using plants, and then that can be injected in. So you're just giving the spike protein in its form, and then an antibody response is made against it. We've also been looking at virus-like particles. That's the one with the plant one, where they use not really a virus, but something which is inherently a virus-like particle that has these spike proteins in it. So that's somewhat similar to HPV vaccine. So lots of different platforms, but all of them are very exciting. And I mean, I think the real key here is that many of them are likely to be effective. We've already seen that with the mRNA vaccines. We're seeing that with the use of a viral vector vaccine like AstraZeneca. And we're starting to see data. We've got phase 1, phase 2, and ongoing phase 3 trials with a number of the other platforms, including the recombinant subunit vaccine that contains the spike protein, which is very exciting. If that works, there's an ability to make large amounts of it. But I go back to the issue too, that the one very key advantage of some of these vaccines is the ability that if the virus changes that spike protein through mutations and the expression of variants, we can very quickly jump on that technology to recode what that looks like and then put that novel new spike protein that the variant expresses out there. So that allows us to very quickly adapt to what the virus might be doing as it mutates in this very active replication that's going on around the world. So very, very excited to see this kind of thing. And, you know, Dr. Quash's committee is going to be looking at and continues to look at a lot of these and to provide advice, which would then be used by others to sort of determine, you know, where they should be used and how they should be used. So her committee is going to be very, very busy in this year, if she hasn't already seen it, with looking at all of these new technologies.
Yeah, it was very exciting that these are on their way, and people are going to definitely be looking out for them. We're going to go back to Caroline for a moment. Caroline, we understand that NACI, or the National Advisory Committee on Immunization, has set some recommendations about prioritizing who should receive the vaccine given the limited supply. Can you briefly describe how your committee went about this process?
Sure, and maybe just to tell Gerald that yes, I had realized that we were going to be busy. But so the way we did this, and we started this past summer, was first to do an environmental scan of international guidance on prioritization of key populations. And then we also did a national survey of expert stakeholders, but also of the Canadian population to see who they thought should be protected first, keeping in mind that the public health objectives of this pandemic preparedness is to limit the complications and death associated with COVID, but also to limit societal disruption. We then had the Alberta Research Centre for Health Evidence do a systematic review of risk factors for severe COVID-19 that was done last fall, and finally applied the ethics, equity, feasibility, and acceptability framework to the various recommendations. So that also needs to be updated, but that led to the first prioritization that you've seen, so that in stage 1, what we were going to, the people we were going to vaccinate first were the high-risk populations that were included in the elderly, 70 to 80 years of age, residents and staff of congregate living arrangements, such as long-term care facilities, the frontline healthcare workers, and those living or working, those whose living or working conditions increase their risk for infection or disproportionate consequences. When we did that, however, we didn't know how many vaccines we were going to have, and we didn't have the actual data from the vaccine trial. So when we learned that we only had 6 million doses for Canada for Q1, we then prioritized stage 1. So that's now separated into starting with the elderly in long-term care facilities and people who care for them, and then going to frontline healthcare workers, and then going down to the other elderlies that are not necessarily in congregate living, and eventually going to essential workers and those whose living or working conditions put them are at higher risk. We are now starting the other stages of prioritization, and that should be done in January or February. We're also expecting a new systematic review from ARCH to see the updated risk factors, because when we did it in the fall, for instance, pregnancy was not at that point in time a risk factors for complications, whereas now there seems to be more data pointing towards an increased risk of ICU admission and complications. So that's still in the works, but you are going to hear from us again soon. Thank you.
Fantastic. And one follow-up question for you, Caroline. I'm actually going to ask you this first, but then I'm going to give Mike and Gerald a chance to speak about their experience in their provinces. There seems to be differences in the way the provinces have started to roll out the vaccine. So, even within provinces, there seems to be some regional variation in terms of responsibility. For instance, Ontario, a lot of the hospitals and public health units have done some of the heavy lifting so far. How would you say the rollout is going in your province? And do you think family physicians and other primary care providers will eventually play more of a role to speed up the process of getting shots into arms?
Yes, I think the first thing we need to realize is that one needs to blame the Constitution for the way things are being rolled out at this point in time in terms of health, right? Because as much as we would like to have a united healthcare system, it's not. Health is of provincial jurisdictions, and that's why we are seeing variability in vaccine rollouts in various provinces. I tend to say that NACI just today is releasing their recommendation on extended time interval between doses, and what we've recommended is to preferably give the second dose within 6 weeks of the first dose. And what that allows us is for provinces to adapt based on their logistics, but also epidemiological context, to see if they would prefer to vaccinate more people up front with the doses that they have in hand, or keep some doses back to make sure that people are getting their second dose. And I think that when you look at mathematical modeling, what that shows is that you are going to have much more health gains in terms of prevention of complications, hospitalizations, and whatnot if you deploy your doses to more people, given the fact that after one dose, you seem to have at least 90% efficacy for a certain period of time. And the question, the uncertainty here is how long will that efficacy last? So in Quebec currently, what has happened is that long-term care facility residents and people taking care of them have been vaccinated. I think they are expected to be all vaccinated in the next week or so. They have started vaccinating frontline healthcare workers, mainly those who are taking care of COVID units, ICUs, long-term care facilities, emergency rooms, OR. At this point in time, I'm not vaccinated yet, which shows you that I can't jump the line, even though I'm the chair of the National Advisory Committee on Immunization, and I think that's fine because I'm not seeing patients. I'm a pediatrician, so already from the get-go, we don't have many patients admitted, and I'm not on the COVID ward. So I think, yes, we would like to see this going much faster, but given the complexity of this vaccine, the Pfizer one in particular, which needs to be frozen at -80, cannot be moved really once delivered into one place. You have to deliver 975 doses in one spot, and then people have to congregate to that setting to be vaccinated. You have to use all the doses within 6 hours of puncturing a vial that contains 5 to 6 doses. So all that makes it much more complicated to have a very efficient distribution. And that's also, I think, why family physicians are not, at this point in time, able to vaccinate through their offices. However, I think that your roles as family physicians are to counsel your patient population to get vaccinated, because we're already hearing that there's a fair proportion of people who are vaccine hesitant towards this vaccine. So giving them the right information and making them understand that if we are not all vaccinated or almost all vaccinated, we will not be able to get out of this rut. That's already helpful. And I think that some people might also in various provinces be able to volunteer to become vaccinators in various point of services. Thank you.
And just, Mike, I'll turn to you for a minute. How's the rollout going in Alberta? And, can you give us a little bit of a flavor of the role of family physicians so far in the rollout?
Sure. No, and maybe I'll speak that I'm not in the higher levels and knowing exactly how this is rolling out. I think and I guess I would say be careful what you read in the papers, because Alberta is not the best at everything, contrary to the provincial leads. I would agree with Carolyn. I think our family physicians should be educators and not vaccinators. I think in Alberta, family physicians don't normally give vaccines, and with the complexity of the vaccine, especially the Pfizer and the storage and all the other issues, I really don't think that we should be doing this. I think we should be educating our patients, just like Carolyn said, about the potential benefits and potential harms, the potential adverse events of any vaccination program. I think that we should be in Alberta. I think we're going to start rolling out to pharmacies. I think we're going to probably start having mobile clinics. I have a kid in university that's doing online, and I think mobile clinics, like for a large setting like universities, will be ramped up. So I think that we would be better off kind of following the game plan. I agree with Carolyn. We'd be better off following the national procurement and Alberta going it alone and trying to buy its own doses of vaccine, which was on the news last night, is not the way to go about. And I think overall, we wish for everybody to be vaccinated as soon as possible, but I think we have to do it reasonably and correctly and in the right hands. And in Alberta, I don't think that's in the family physicians' offices.
Yeah, and just one point before I ask Gerald, in terms of education and vaccine hesitancy, there is a website called 19 to 0. It was started actually by one of the public health docs in Alberta with collaboration across the country. We'll post it in the live YouTube chat. I would recommend the audience check it out. Great information on that website, and it's constantly updated. Gerald, how's it going in Ontario? And from your Kingston office point of view, how are family physicians getting involved?
Yeah, thanks, Alan. I got a kick out of it. So how's it going in Ontario? And I started to sort of do a little bit of a chuckle. It's very complex. And I have to really say that, Dr. Quash's remarks and Mike's remarks really are really front and center of a lot of the complexities that are related here. So this vaccine platform, particularly the Pfizer one with ultra low temperature things, has made it hard. But the problem here is that we're getting this kind of admixture of a whole bunch of influences. Obviously, some of them are political, and Carolyn's touched on that to some extent. And I think that politicians would be better off to listen to expert groups like NACI, listen to their science groups and physicians about, how this might be prioritized. And I think it's important for the people listening in here to understand, there's two concepts here. One is the risk of getting infected, and that's where healthcare workers and long-term care staff get involved to be high priority. And the other one is the risk if you get infected, what's the likelihood you're going to have a bad outcome? And that's where you get into not just people who live in long-term care, but our senior citizens out there who are living at home who may be also at risk. And so that gets mixed into it. But at the same time, what I've been seeing a lot of is a lot of advocacy. It's very well-intentioned advocacy by many people to move either groups of patients that they treat or groups of patients they represent or segments of the population they represent to move them to the front of the line. The problem is you can't have everybody at the front of the line. There has to be somebody who's in the middle of the line, and some people are at the back of the line. And certainly young, healthy adults, you can sort of put them towards the back of the line. Although some of my epidemiology colleagues would argue that there are strategies which have been modeled looking at vaccinating people who are more likely to transmit as an immediate way of getting control. So there's lots and lots of factors that come into play. Things are proceeding here in Ontario. Most of it, because of the Pfizer vaccine, are centered around hospitals working to help facilitate the highest priority group, which is long-term care residents and long-term care staff. So that part is there, but it continues to be a sort of a movement afoot. And frankly, I would like to see, for the very reasons that Mike laid out, that sort of involvement from family physicians around education, talking to their patients, particularly those that are vaccine hesitant, to really make sure they get that information. And I would really echo the comment, Alan, that you made around the site group that developed that program, not the least of which there's my conflict of interest. I'm in that group, and I worked with that group of people to sort of set up that education website so that you can direct people there to get the correct information. So I think of all things with vaccine, rollout has been the most challenging and will continue to be until we have sufficient amount of virus flowing out that we can really get to all these groups.
Perfect. And just before I get back to Mike K for some more evidence questions, since you and I both work in Ontario, Gerald, I'll just do one more plug, and our group will put this in the chat. There's a great website from an organization called the Center for Effective Practice. They've done a lot of work during the pandemic, and they have a specific website about the COVID-19 vaccine. A lot of great information there, including about vaccine hesitancy. So please, members, check that out. Okay, Mike, back to you. What were the common adverse events reported in the vaccine trials? And can you also explain solicited versus unsolicited adverse events?
Sure. Thanks, Alan. And I agree with all the other comments thus far. Yeah, rollouts are the rollouts, and there's challenges, and do the right thing, and not everybody can be first. Exactly. So back to adverse events of the vaccine. So I don't think there's been a group of medications or vaccines that have been as such scrutinized as obviously this rapid rollout of these big three. Be rest assured, these vaccines are safe. So serious adverse events were about 0.5% in both the placebo and the vaccine arms in Pfizer, Moderna, and the AstraZeneca's Oxford. Solicited and unsolicited adverse events are super important. So solicited adverse events in the three studies, and definitely in the Pfizer, Moderna one, were they would have a subgroup of the patients, and they would actually have somebody call them or have them electronically fill in a diary every day for the 7 days thereafter. So it's almost like a review of systems and a periodic health exam. And we know how sometimes that is not the most useful and efficacious use of your time because everything is positive. So solicited adverse events: did you have a headache? Did you have a sore arm? Were you tired? And so they're asking them explicitly and directly for the 7 days after. So solicited adverse events inherently, compared to unsolicited adverse events where you don't say anything and you wait for the patient to bring up the concern. So again, that's unsolicited. So just by nature of how you ask the question, solicited adverse events in these studies were 5 to 10 times, even up to 20 times more common than the unsolicited adverse events. So solicited adverse events: did you have a sore arm? Well, 80% of patients got a sore arm with a vaccine, and that's probably not surprising. More importantly, the unsolicited adverse events, and just going through some of them: Pfizer vaccine, unsolicited adverse events: injection site pain was about 10%, fatigue 6%, and myalgias or headaches about 5%. Kind of standard and exactly what we see with other vaccine research and evidence. And again, just put it into context. So again, fatigue was 6% for Pfizer vaccine, and that's unsolicited. And solicited for the vaccine, it was up to 60% a day. And unsolicited. Again, for Pfizer, again, serious adverse events were very similar, and deaths were similar between the groups. I'll leave anaphylaxis for the end, if that's okay with you, Alan, and I'll come back to that afterwards. So Moderna, very similar. Unsolicited adverse events were about 3% for headache, fatigue 2%, and some lymphadenopathy about 1%, and solicited 5 to 20 times more common. Again, sore arm, that kind of stuff. Serious adverse events the same, and deaths similar. There were 4 cases of Bell's palsy in the Moderna arm, 3 in the vaccine. In the Moderna trial, 3 in the vaccine and 1 in placebo. When you look at baseline rates, remember, these are 30,000 patients being followed for 2 months. So the baseline rate of Bell's palsy was exactly about where it should be. And AstraZeneca, same thing. The solicited, unsolicited, again, quite a bit different. Interestingly, with the AstraZeneca vaccine, as you know, the trials were halted for cases of transverse myelitis, and there was a total of 3 cases, 2 in the vaccine and 1 in placebo. Transverse myelitis is fairly rare, and so this might be the one where you say maybe it's a little more common than the baseline rate. However, the groups that deemed this was really unrelated to the vaccine. One had an undiagnosed case of multiple sclerosis and stuff like that. Again, mortality was similar in the AstraZeneca arm. So again, or the AstraZeneca study. Overall, these vaccines are safe. They are very similar to all of the other vaccines, whether it be the zoster vaccine, the influenza vaccine. What's different is maybe anaphylaxis. And Alan, if we have a couple minutes to talk about anaphylaxis.
Yeah, I would go right into it.
Okay, you betcha. So as you know, day 1 of the rollout in Europe had 2 cases of anaphylaxis reported. Both those cases were people with underlying allergies and hypersensitivity and carry around EpiPens. They did just fine, but it kind of made you wonder what's going on with anaphylaxis. There was a paper in New England Journal at the end of the last month, that postulated that maybe anaphylaxis was more common in Pfizer vaccine, and maybe a 1 in 100,000 cases. 1 in 100,000 vaccines would put in perspective the risk of anaphylaxis to an influenza vaccine is about 1 in a million. Last week, CDC came out with their post-marketing surveillance on anaphylaxis, and actually it's about right. 1 in 90,000 has been reported in the US related to the Pfizer vaccine. There have been anaphylaxis reported in Moderna as well, but that's kind of the best number that we have. So while it might be 10 times more common to be anaphylactic post-Pfizer vaccine, and I must say that in that CDC report, 80% of the patients that reported anaphylaxis did have underlying hypersensitivity, allergies, that kind of stuff. So it might be 10 times more common. The baseline rate is very low. So I think a really good teaching point for our patients is to say the risk of anaphylaxis is about 1 in 100,000, and the majority of these people do have underlying hypersensitivity, allergies, that kind of stuff.
That was excellent. So Mike, I think we'll give you a break, and I'll turn to Gerald for a second and ask, Gerald, are there any contraindications to receiving the COVID-19 vaccines that have been approved so far?
Right. So if you do look at the product monograph, they mention a number of things which are relevant. As Mike's kind of gone over, there were younger individuals were excluded in both of the mRNA vaccine trials. For Pfizer, it was anyone under 16 wasn't allowed to be enrolled. In the Moderna trial, anyone under 18. We have general recommendations that are generic to vaccines. You shouldn't probably vaccinate somebody who's had another vaccine recently, just because we always worry a little bit about some immunological interference. People who have suspected or confirmed COVID-19 should be delayed for a period of time because they were not studied, and that was an exclusion criteria within the trials to determine the best time. And right now, the current recommendation that's out there is likely to wait for about somewhere around 3 months before you vaccinate them. The issue around others that were not included in the trial, like women who are pregnant or breastfeeding, or patients with a variety of immunosuppressive disorders, they were not necessarily included in the trial. And I think the general recommendation that we're seeing amongst certainly my colleagues in infectious diseases and others is that should be looked at on a case-by-case basis. I do not believe at the moment there's sufficient evidence to suggest they should not receive the vaccine, but a discussion should be had inherently to sort of understand what role you might have. And that's really related to two things, not so much the likelihood of adverse reactions, but immunogenicity of vaccines varies, and people who are immunosuppressed for varying reasons may have suboptimal immunogenic responses to vaccines, and so that has to be included in the discussion. The other one, of course, is the generic issue about an intramuscular vaccine in somebody who has a bleeding disorder or is on anticoagulant therapy, and so some understanding of the potential possibility, much higher possibility of a hematoma at the site of injection is relevant. But again, it's always a risk-benefit ratio. There can be enormous obvious benefits to receiving the vaccine, and as long as the risk is small, discernible, or at least extrapolatable, maybe is the word to use, then I think those are all reasonable things to do when it comes to determining whether there's a contraindication.
Yeah, and just back to Mike for a second. Mike, a lot of family physicians across Canada provide prenatal care and deliver babies. What advice should we be giving pregnant women and breastfeeding mothers about getting?
Well, just about the anaphylaxis, we didn't report anaphylaxis in the serious adverse events in the big 3 studies. Just a point that people with previous anaphylaxis to other vaccines and significant hypersensitivity were excluded from the big 3 initially. So just really maybe just a shout out that if you do see a patient that has anaphylaxis post, we're very, physicians are not great at post-marketing surveillance, but as we know, Health Canada has a post-marketing vaccine surveillance, and I would encourage everybody reporting that if you potentially see that. Just one other point on Gerald's point, Pfizer, as we know, are enrolling 12 to 15-year-olds. So maybe that age extension, I wouldn't anticipate a report on that for about 6 months. So maybe 12 to 15-year-olds we'd probably get some information down the road. So pregnant and breastfeeding women, I would put this into SOGC, just put a guideline out. I think it makes a lot of sense. Again, just like Gerald said, have a risk-benefit discussion. I think that if you're in a high prevalent area with COVID cases, I think we also know that as Carolyn said earlier, that pregnant women seem to be at higher risk, and again, the numbers are lower, but higher risk relatively of getting severe COVID infections. And I think having a good discussion about the pros and cons of being vaccinated and letting the patient decide, I think makes a ton of sense. I don't think there's a reason, I agree with Gerald, not to do it. And I think this is exactly how vaccines and medicines roll out and how they mature. You first look at a group of people and you exclude some people with other comorbidities and immunosuppressants and anaphylaxis and that. And then you move them beyond to children and you move them on to pregnant and breastfeeding women. And I think as the vaccine science matures, I think that we're going to see that this is this is not a live vaccine. I don't think there's really, if common sense would say there's not really any worry or risk, but it hasn't been studied. And I would actually have the discussion and support them. And I would probably tend to encourage the vaccination. Obviously, if you're in a high endemic and in a high area, and again, go science. On the same token, go common sense.
Yeah, no, it's great that we all seem to agree that shared decision making is really key. Just a quick plug for one of my colleagues in the Department of Family and Community Medicine at U of T. Tully Bogler is a family doc who's done a lot of work in the area of pregnancy and COVID-19. She has a Twitter handle at Pandemic Pregnancy Guide. And I think we're also going to put an Instagram link in the chat. You should all check that out. There's some great information there about pregnancy and breastfeeding and COVID-19. And sorry, shameless plug for one of my colleagues. Okay, we're starting to move into the live Q&A. So Caroline, we're going to go back to you. So, you know, we've been talking all about these vaccines, and it sounds like things are pretty good in terms of safety, and we've covered a lot of territory. Yet there's still people out there that think COVID-19 is a mild disease. They don't need to be vaccinated. Are there any strategies that either NACI or just from yourself as a practicing physician can share with the audience in terms of how to combat vaccine hesitancy and maybe go a little bit more into, you were saying before that family doctors can play a role in this area?
Yeah, so I think NACI hasn't developed strategies, but we are monitoring what's happening out there. I think what needs to be done is really a transparent discussion of what's known and what's not known about the vaccine. I think that what stops a lot of people is this uncertainty about adverse events following immunization. We've addressed that also previously, the rapidity at which the vaccines were developed. And I think family physicians have a role there to play to explain to their patients how that happened and also look at the benefits of the vaccine. So yes, you know, COVID disease might be mild for some people. The problem is you never know who is going to get a mild disease and who will not. And even in the younger population, we have younger patients in the ICU, you know, requiring to be intubation and who have a very long recovery. We also have people who have, you know, more or less mild symptoms, but who will remain with the long-term fatigue and all those longer-term complications that we're discovering as we're moving forward. I mean, personally, if I had a choice, I would rather not get COVID and get the vaccine. But it's really this conversation and being very open and transparent about what we've seen in the phase 3 trials and what is not known yet. And the discussion that Gerald was just talking about, this shared decision for populations in whom we don't have a lot of evidence. So all those that are immunosuppressed, the autoimmune conditions, I think, is a area where people are having a lot of discussions. I mean, to be fully transparent, the reason why people are hesitating a bit is that the older mRNA vaccines technology were used for cancer treatment. And so at that point in time, the goal of that vaccine was really to elicit a response of our cells against that cancer, which was part of us. However, these new mRNA vaccines for infectious diseases have been modified so that there's no anti-self response. At this point in time, we don't have much evidence to say that people with an autoimmune disorder are at any increased risk of getting relapses from their illness, but it's something that we're following closely. And so that is something, you know, in all transparency that we've put in the NACI statement. But we have some people with autoimmune diseases in the 2 trials that have been described by Mike. But again, you know, most of those population were healthy at the baseline. So, you know, it's just the real world data will help us understand that better. But in theory, there's nothing that will tell us that it's an increased risk for people with autoimmune diseases. So it's really discussing it with your patients. Thank you.
Oh, that's great. Now I'm going to turn to Mike Colbert. Mike, one of the members wants to know, if you get vaccinated, does that mean you can be more relaxed about public health recommendations like universal masking, hand hygiene, and social distancing?
The quick answer would be no. Again, nothing's 100% perfect. Again, these vaccines seem to decrease the relative risk of getting it 95, 94, and 70%. So I still think it's very prudent to do all these other PPE and all the other recommendations. I think that down the road, once we get the substantial population vaccinated and we see these numbers 60 to 70% herd immunity, maybe we'll start lightening off on these things. I don't think we're going to be masking and bubbling forever. And again, back to Gerald's comment, it's important to get the vaccine rolled out quickly and to get those numbers back up.
Caroline, you wanted to add something on this point?
Yeah, I think that the other point that needs to be remembered is that when you look at the phase 3 trials from Pfizer and Moderna, what the vaccine was preventing are symptomatic diseases. So at this point in time, we don't have the data to say if those two vaccines are actually able to prevent asymptomatic infections in which you would not have any symptoms, but you would still be able to transmit disease to somebody who is vulnerable. I think that with time, we're going to get that data. Moderna published or released interim analyses that showed that before the second dose, there were 0.3% of people in the placebo group that were excreting or that were PCR positive when they were tested randomly without symptoms versus 0.1% in the group that had been vaccinated. We don't have any of that data for Pfizer, but it's something that we're looking at. So just the additional point to what Mike was saying is that we don't know yet that these vaccines are actually able to cut down the transmission risk. Thank you.
Perfect.
Thank you, Caroline. I forgot to mention it. I got one more point as well, Alan, if that's okay with you, is
Sure.
Again, when we're discussing with our patients in previous addressing vaccine hesitancy, it's really important just to give the numbers. And so the numbers are 3,000 people die per day in the US and 200 die per day in Canada. And if they're worried about adverse event, again, if you really think the serious adverse events are low and the same between placebo and vaccine, and anaphylaxis is 1 in 90,000 at the top and maybe 1 in 100,000. So I think trying to address vaccine hesitancy, not resistance, because resistance might be futile, but hesitancy, I think in the past it's been shown just if you give those numbers, people can make hopefully an informed decision. And to me, that risk benefit the benefit far outweighs any potential risk of these vaccines.
No, that's perfect. Gerald, this one's for you. A lot of the healthcare providers who get vaccinated are being told that they might develop side effects. We've covered those, but somebody mentioned that they might have a higher risk of side effects after the second dose. So my question is, if that happens to them, can they still go to work? And are there any specific side effects where you might say, hey, you might actually have been infected with COVID prior to getting that second dose, and you actually need to stay home and get swabbed? Could you kind of cover those two topics?
Yeah, great questions. So I think generally speaking, we know that many vaccines produce incidentally either local or mild systemic responses. And so that's part and parcel of what we're going to see with this. Certainly in the trials that Mike was covering, they looked at adverse reactions with first dose versus second dose. In the case of the AstraZeneca one, it was more common with the first dose, but with the mRNAs with the second dose. Some of these are predictable, they're mild. But the ones I'd be worried about are the ones that really suggest the potential for intercurrent infection. And we've already seen cases of people who were immunized, and Carolyn touched on this within the trials, but we've seen now cases where people were immunized and then did develop COVID within a few days of that vaccine, recognizing that, the separation of those curves occurred out at about 12 days post first dose. So in those circumstances, you have to be wary, especially if you've received the dose in an area where there's a high prevalence of virus, that you might just have gotten COVID coincidentally after you got your shot, not because of the shot, but afterwards. So obviously a fever, anosmia, a lot of the very specific signs, shortness of breath, cough, respiratory symptoms, you should not be coming to work. But that's a generic statement. I mean, if we haven't emphasized enough to people now, if you're unwell, you should not be going to work. And I recognize that it's easy for a guy like me to say that, but essentially this is so incredibly important during a pandemic, but it's also important general infection prevention and control measures. Obviously, in the hospitals, we're very worried about it, but all other places, we should not have people who are unwell going to work, whether it's from just a natural rhinovirus infection or something, or whether it's from COVID, which is obviously a big, huge issue. And so it gets a little bit tricky. But I think if people have questions, they should reach out to their occupational health and safety groups wherever they're working, should those exist. If not, certainly touching base with a physician, which may or may not necessitate you being able to call your family physician and get some answers over the phone about it, and or even a visit to an urgent care clinic or something like that might help to address it. But yeah, this is going to be an ongoing issue, and we've certainly seen some very mild reactions which people might interpret as an impending infection like fatigue and muscle aches. So a little help from a medical professional or occupational health and safety can probably help sort those out.
Perfect. Caroline, the last question goes to you before we start to wrap it up. Will every Canadian have access to a COVID-19 vaccine, and what does that timeline look like?
Well, that's a great question, and I would love to have that crystal ball in front of me. It depends really on whether or not the next two vaccines that are currently being reviewed by Health Canada, so the AstraZeneca one that Mike spoke about, but also the Janssen Johnson & Johnson one, become available. And it also depends on whether or not Pfizer and Moderna are able to deliver the doses that they are supposed to deliver. If all that goes well, we think that all Canadians should be able to get vaccinated by the fall of 2021. So we're hoping that the vaccines are going to still, continue to come in at the expected pace. And if that's the case, then hopefully next fall we're going to be happier. Thank you.
Awesome. All right, we have 5 minutes to go, so I'm going to call on each of you to spend about 30 seconds and maybe leave the audience with one or two take-home points that you think are either really important that we mentioned today or that we may not have gotten to mention. We will start with Mike.
Thanks. Yeah, so I would say in summary, we have two currently approved vaccines that show about a 95% relative efficacy in interim analysis at 2 months out. And we have a third one coming down the pipe, likely Astra, which shows about a 70%. And as Carolyn said, numerous other ones following down. Johnson & Johnson is probably next up. These appear safe with serious adverse events similar between the placebo and the vaccine arm. And the true risk of anaphylaxis, we're getting about 1 in 100,000. Again, putting in context of the number of people that die per day in Canada or the US, the safety profile to me is very advantageous. Ongoing studies for adolescents, Pfizer again doing 12 to 15-year-olds, pregnant women. I think it's again at breastfeeding is a risk-benefit discussion and no reasons not to do them. Whether we need a booster, how long this is efficacious for will remain to be seen. And single-dose efficacy, I'd really hold off. Let the science, and while there is some efficacy on single dose, again, that was a subgroup of a subgroup, and I think let the procurement do its job, and let's get the second vaccine. And I don't think it has to be at 21 and at 28. And as Carolyn said, there's a little bit of leeway, I think, to provide that second dose.
Perfect. Gerald?
Yeah, I'm gonna get a little philosophical on you here. So this vaccination, these vaccines that are coming out are one of a few tools we have in our toolbox. This is a really important tool, and it is certainly, I think, going to be a pivotal point. If I can take the paraphrase of our title of this webinar today, it's going to be a pivotal point in the control of this particular pandemic. Having said that, I think people have to recognize you have to continue to use the other tools. The other tools are all the things we're doing around social distancing. So that is wearing a mask, physical distancing when you're around others, avoiding circumstances, particularly indoors, which facilitate transmission of COVID-19, washing your hands a lot, staying home when you're sick, so you don't go to work and give it to everybody else. So these are all the tools that we have. And I think unfortunately what we've seen is that human behavior has not really helped us a lot because there's resistance to some of these tools. The only thing about the vaccine that's challenging is the whole issue of vaccine hesitancy and people not taking it. But the vaccine, as important as they are, is only one of the tools that we have to deal with this pandemic. And not to be the total Debbie Downer here, but hopefully it's going to be a number of decades or years until the next pandemic hits. But this is the beginning of what the future holds for us. So I'll stop at that point.
Caroline?
Well, going after Dr. Evans and Dr. Colbert doesn't allow me to say much because these two guys are very thorough. So not having much to add, I think my main take-home message is that family physicians have a key role to play in vaccine hesitancy and in counseling their patient population. So I know that there's a lot of data, but keeping up to date through webinars like this is, to me, the most important thing, so that you're able to tell your patients why it is so important to get vaccinated so that we can move on to the next phase of our lives. Thank you.
No, that's great. And, you know, I'm going to steal something from some of my family physician and primary care colleagues in Ontario that have been doing some great work locally and provincially. They call it the 4 gets. So get educated. I think we did that today. Get vaccinated if appropriate, and tell people that you got the shot and you're not afraid of it. Get skilled. So try to apply the evidence to combat and address vaccine hesitancy with your patients and colleagues. And get engaged, you know, speak to your public health units, your hospitals, volunteer to get shots in arms. This is going to be a big team effort. So I call those the 4 gets. So I want to thank our 3 speakers, Caroline, Gerald, and Mike, for taking time out of your busy schedules to both prepare for and be with us today. You guys were excellent. There was a ton of great information. A reminder to our viewers that if they have colleagues that didn't get a chance to watch this live, it was recorded. We will be posting the recorded video on our website, and we'll tweet about it, and you can watch it at your leisure when you have more time. To claim Main Pro Plus credits, please fill out the online survey, which has been provided and will be open until the end of the day Friday. That's in the chat screen. 2 upcoming webinars to let you know about. On January 19th, we will have a webinar called Anyone Care, or A1C, about clinical outcomes, simplified diabetes, with Dr. Mike Allen and Dr. Tina Kay. And then on February 23rd, we're going to have 2020 in 2021, primary care approach to common eye problems with Dr. Simon Moore and Dr. Christine Richardson. We do like to have fancy titles with these webinars. I want to thank our members and audience for joining us. Please keep up the good work. We really appreciate everything you're doing in all of your communities across Canada and across the world. And stay safe, and thank you so much.